Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here we will have now the first of another movie review which will begin a series of reviews covering some of my most favourite films ever. Now, these films won't necessarily be the most perfect 10 out of 10, but these are films that I can watch endlessly again and again, and films that I think thoroughly are amongst some of the best ever that I've seen within my own lifetime. Now, the first review within this series, we will cover and focus on Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. This is of course a biopic of the actor and martial artist Bruce Lee, still to this day seen as one of the most iconic and influential figures in martial arts and action cinema. With both his personality and his incredible, almost unfathomable fighting skills, Lee had a truly transcendent impact on the entertainment industry that can still be seen today, many years following his death, throughout many films, books, comics, anime, computer games and television. The film itself, released in April the 28th, 1993, it stars Jason Scott Lee, who was no relation, in the iconic lead role, Lauren Holly as his wife Linda, and also Robert Wagner, and it was directed by Rob Cohen. The film of course covers the main highlights of Lee's life, all at really a surface level, from his youth, where you see him getting into multiple fights at dance proms or in the kitchens where he started working as a dishwasher. We go through all of his college years where he started teaching martial arts and meeting his eventual wife Linda. We go through all of the racial prejudice that he managed to confront throughout his college years, the struggles that both the couple faced in order to gain acceptance from her family, the various injuries that he suffered throughout both his training and his development as a martial artist, all of the barriers and antagonism that he faced against when trying to introduce the new martial arts culture to a mainstream audience, and of course we focus on his very brief and unfortunately short-lived career in entertainment, following his breakout roles in television and also the few movie roles that he endured in the start of his career. Now, when looking back on Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, it's a movie I've watched multiple times and I've always found it to be supremely entertaining, very fun to watch, full of warmth, depth, emotion, and of course there's a great energy and action about it as well. Now, it could be argued that it's a very typical glossy biopic, telling all of the very familiar beats of the typical rags to riches story. You know, we have the foreigner who goes to chase the American dream, doesn't start off very well, comes across various battles and struggles, and then eventually rises to iconic status. So it is a story that we've seen multiple times throughout various movies. Yes, it's very romanticized, and you could also argue that yes, it is very safe and it actually does take certain liberties with what actually happened within Lee's life, and I will allude to this later on throughout this review. So those are all very valid criticisms when looking back on this movie, but despite those, it is a film that I've grown to love for multiple reasons, and I think primarily there are three very special attributes that I think highlight Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and that makes it such a great film to watch. So obviously the first and most obvious attribute that we have to talk about, and that is of course Jason Scott Lee's in what is truly an incredible performance in the lead role. Now, he may not look facially much like Bruce, but he embodies so much the charisma, the likability, the presence and the character of the man, and he does this so well that you completely want to believe in him and all of his ambitions and how he was able to entice people into believing in the martial arts and all of his ideas and philosophies throughout. And he just comes across as such a rootable and likable character overall, despite all of the struggles and the various arguments that he has throughout this movie. And of course, being in absolute peak physical conditioning, which was obviously necessary when you are making a film about Bruce Lee, you know, that goes without saying, but I think you also have to credit Jason for getting in really such an incredible physical state, and I think that very much makes the fight scenes especially all the more convincing. And I actually personally feel that it was somewhat of an injustice that he didn't at the very least get an Oscar nomination for his role. I know that for this year Tom Hanks eventually won for his role as Philadelphia, and that was a very strong performance, but I would equally argue the case for Jason Scott Lee, and I don't think it would have been any mistake or mishap at all if he did indeed win the Oscar for his performance here, which I think is truly exemplary throughout the whole movie. And also, to be fair, we shouldn't discount the performance of Lauren Holly as Linda Lee. Of course, her role is very important to this overall story, and Lauren Holly performs this very well. She's very sweet-natured, very passionate, very determined. We see multiple scenes when we see Bruce enduring the after effects of his back injury, and really Linda is the steel. She is the rock that he really has to rely upon as he tries to make his road to recovery. And I think Holly conveys that very much of a strong, plucky, determined quality about Linda Lee, and I think she does this very well. And she's very beautiful throughout this movie as well in supporting Bruce, and you truly believe in their relationship. And I think that's very critical, that when you have a movie that is really primarily hinged on the two lead performances, it's the relationship between Bruce and Linda that is so critical and so special to this story. And I think both actors perform their roles very well, and they do both a tremendous job in creating a very much of a believable romance and love story between the two characters. The second most important attribute for me is the musical score, which is by Randy Elderman, and I love this musical score so much as it really helps to bring so much of the heart, the sentimentality, the emotion and the gravitas throughout all of the sequences throughout, whether we see Bruce training, whether we see him meeting Linda for the first time, later on when we see him reuniting with his family and they're on the boat sailing through Hong Kong. All of these scenes just really help you pull you in as a viewer, just conveying so much of the heart and the spirit and the tone throughout all of the movie. And I think Randy Elderman's musical score really hits those heartfelt moments and those beats as we see the story unfold. The third special attribute of this film, which so many who have seen this film will highlight about, and that's of course the fight sequences, which are truly exceptional. Of course, for a Bruce Lee movie you would expect that, right? So I think first of all you have to credit how much effort and how much attention to detail was brought in to make sure that if you're going to have fight scenes throughout the Bruce Lee movie, that they do have to be of an exceptional standard. Now, I have heard some criticisms throughout the years about this movie, how maybe they weren't at the same pace as what we saw throughout Bruce Lee's own movies, but they wouldn't be, right? Because Bruce Lee was obviously a completely unique individual. Nobody could really match his own skill, his own flexibility, his own physical capability. So I don't think it would have been appropriate to try and literally replicate all of the physicality of Bruce Lee. I think if you could come close to it and still match the overall intensity and the skill set that we see throughout, then I think that was more than appropriate for this film. And I think this film does a fine job in really encapsulating the fighting intensity and the skill set that Bruce has for all of his fighting encounters. You know, we bemoan so much of today's movies that are too reliant on the shaky cam and the quick and fast edits and the overall close-ups of the two combatants, and a lot of the time it makes it difficult to see what's going on and who's fighting who. But this film here is much more of a reminder of back in the day when I think a lot of fight sequences were far more precise, far more coherent and far more composed in showing all the different maneuvers and the punch and kicks and the somersaults and the pirouettes thrown. It's a much higher skill set to really show the two combatants in a much more of a wider space, and we see this multiple times throughout the movie, where we see Bruce is fighting in the streets, or he's fighting in the dance proms, or later on in certain arenas or fighting rings as well. They do such a great job at making you see the action, making you see both the combatants involved, and that's so typical, very much so, of Bruce Lee's own movies. You know, when if you look back in the choreography that he staged throughout, it was very clear and coherent, very snappy, very quick, but you could always make out what was going on. I think that was a really special attribute that they brought forward when visualizing the fight sequences throughout this movie. And really, right from the get-go, all of the fight scenes are brilliantly staged and set up, and in particular the standouts throughout this movie are of course Bruce's fights with Johnny Sin, of which he has two. Johnny Sin, of course, is the opponent fictionalized for this film that he faces when fighting for his right to teach the martial arts. And these fight scenes are truly magnificent, particularly the first encounter. You know, everything from the music to the setup, where we see both combatants doing their warm-up, stretching, thrusting punches and kicks, warming up, and we really get the emphasizing of all the clicking of the joints and clicking of the veins. And if you actually know or have watched Bruce Lee's previous movies, they actually repeat the same warm-up moves that he practiced in his iconic fight scene with Chuck Norris in The Way of the Dragon. So I thought that was a very nice way of putting reference to his previous work as well. And throughout all of these fight scenes, this first one in particular, all of the punches and the kicks and the screams are supremely intense. They have a real thrust and danger and tension and suspense. The second encounter he has with Johnny Sin, when he is promoting his fighting techniques and he boasts that he can beat any opponent in 60 seconds, and Johnny Sin returns, and this is of course post the injury that he suffered at the end of the first climatic battle. And this sequence is again fantastic. We get it in the fighting ring this time, and we get lots more slow motion shots where we see Bruce with that typical fighting style when he's on his toes, you know, moving around the ring as such, elegantly, so much fantastic to watch. And then we of course go on to the third fight sequence, which albeit is a completely fictionalized encounter on the film set of The Big Boss, which is his first major movie, and this is still fantastic. We see them fighting across various obstacles throughout the movie set, and of course this has the very infamous, and I still think stunning, shots where we see Bruce infamously punching through the huge ice blocks as well. Just fantastic to watch, really emphasizing the almost comic strip choreography that we see throughout these fight sequences, and it's truly amazing and fantastic to watch. It really just gives the film much more of an immersive experience in my opinion. And of course we have the final encounter showcasing his really mental battle against the Phantom, which is showcased throughout the beginning scene of this movie and is highlighted throughout. Really, they wanted to use this more as a metaphor, I suppose, the ongoing mental struggles that Bruce had. And maybe you could argue maybe it's bringing in too much of a fantasy element, but I think overall, in just trying to show in terms of spirit what was really going on in Bruce's head and his consciousness, I think these work, and I think it's very well done. It's got a very cinematic feel when we see Bruce fighting the Phantom throughout various graveyards and alleyways, and we have all of this smoke and atmospheric music, and I think it pulls it off very well. As mentioned before, the film does feel very safe in terms of portraying Lee's life, showing us really what we already know rather than what we'd actually like to know. And I think this is something that really a lot of biopics, they fall under this trap. They can be accused of really, to be honest, a lot of the time they're constrained by legal implications. You have various relatives of the actual figure, and for legal reasons or personal reasons they won't allow you to display certain aspects of the figure's life. In particular, I look at other examples such as Michael Mann's Ali or Selma as well, you know, concentrating on Martin Luther King of course, and those two are another examples where there always remains a consciousness, I believe, not to tarnish the memory and the legacy of these truly iconic figures. So you really just show the story, in essence, the highlights, the good parts, the best parts, the parts that we remember the most. Not necessarily, if not the dark side necessarily of these figures, if more the truer side. You know, there are so many other fascinating elements to these iconic figures that we want to hear about that maybe haven't been alluded to in certain publications or interviews or articles, and that's the real hidden part that I think we want to see when you're telling these biopics. And yep, it's a fair criticism that Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, is very guilty of really just scratching the surface, and it actually received some criticism a lot for taking liberties with the truth for the sake of making it more entertaining and accessible. I can admittedly mark the film down for. Examples of this include the way in which Bruce originally injured himself. Now, the movie itself shows that this happened within his first encounter with Johnny's son, who actually himself was a fictional character, but in actual real life, this was actually incurred due to a weightlifting accident where Bruce was overexerting himself, and that's how he originally injured his back. As I mentioned before, the on-set fight scene of filming The Big Boss actually didn't happen, and also there are other ideas where we allude to the fact that he conceived the idea for the Kung Fu television series starring David Carradine. Now, in actual fact, this didn't actually happen. Bruce was actually writing a concept for an original idea called The Warrior as well, and when he did eventually audition for the Kung Fu, he was actually rejected because many people felt his accent was too thick and maybe that wouldn't appeal a lot with mainstream audiences. And Bruce Lee actually went on an interview at this time and he actually agreed with the studio's choice to make that decision. And there was also further alleged speculation, if you do your research, that he had a mistress who had been with him at the time within his 5 final moments leading up to his death, where doing some dubbing work for a movie he was complaining of various headaches, and after taking a painkiller which had a certain substance which he had an alleged allergic reaction to. So there are multiple stories and actual certain truths, if you do your research, that the film has omitted. And as I mentioned before, they probably did this a lot to make the film far more smoother in terms of its runtime. As with all cases, there are certain elements that you can't include overall. And I think Rob Cohen, he actually admitted to himself that he was more wanting to capture the essence and the spirit of the man himself, and he wanted to make the film far more entertaining and light-hearted and upbeat in tone of Bruce Lee's original movies. So if we look at all of the factors, in terms of the historical inaccuracies, does it overall affect the overall product of the movie in terms of its enjoyment? And I say no. I think the movie overall does a very satisfactory job in emphasising what was special about Lee, encapsulating his impact and his legacy, and I think overall does honour and pay proper tribute and respect to the man overall. Yes, I will concede that if this movie was made today, it would be far more accurate in terms of what happened. The fight scenes themselves would be far more slower and more realistic. We would get far less of the somersaults and the pirouetting. There would be none of this phantom-like sequence that we see throughout the movie as well. Now, just in case you make it a far more realistic and accurate movie, does that necessarily mean it would make it a far more satisfying experience? I'm not too sure, but all I can say when speaking about this film, I truly believe that it is very entertaining, very accessible, very heartfelt, and lots of upbeat moments. There is a certain euphoric moments about this, also coupled with the truly exceptional fight sequences that we see throughout the movie, and an absolutely brilliant lead performance from Jason Scott Lee, and a good commanding supporting lead from Lauren Holly as well. So I think overall, if you are a major Bruce Lee fan and you are very much empowered by what he meant, what he stood for, and you want the film to capture really all of the excitement, all of the spectacle, and all of the intensity that he represented as a fighting man, as a martial artist, then I think Dragon the Bruce Lee Story is definitely a film that is worthwhile watching. So when we go on to look at the release of the film, and overall it was a financial success. On a budget of 16 million, it managed to gross 63.5 million overall worldwide, so making more than its money back. And many critics at the time cited this as a major success for biopics, because if we think about it, despite the iconic nature of Bruce Lee, there's always going to be a limited fan base. There will be many people who, maybe if they've heard of Bruce Lee, maybe not have been overall interested or overall invested in his movies, and that really goes a lot for a lot of these biopics when you're showing these iconic figures. So I think 63.5 million for, you know, a Bruce Lee movie at the time, I think that was a fantastic return. And I think in some way it does justify the director Rob Cohen's decision to take liberties with the actual events, to make it a much more mainstream appealing for audiences. And as I mentioned before, he really wanted to make it in similar tone to the movies of Bruce Lee that he made himself. Maybe in hindsight now, that may have been not the most ideal approach to take, but you can understand, because obviously Bruce Lee's movies, okay, they may not have been international blockbusters apart from Enter the Dragon, of course, but they still had very much of a cult following. So the idea that you wanted to try to capture the essence of that movie is to really appease the fans of Bruce Lee. I can understand that sentiment and why they took that particular direction overall. Now, critics did like the film when it was released, and some of them did point out to the formulaic storytelling, as I mentioned before, for a typical biopic, and they also alluded to perhaps the more comic strip exaggerated style of the fight sequences, but again, I didn't mind that. I think the film knows what it wants to do, and I think there's nothing wrong in it heightening the experience and the fighting style of Bruce Lee as well. And when they're handled with such skill and such dedication and such expertise, I think it adds to the overall enjoyable experience of the movie. And that's my overall consensus really when I look back on Dragon the Bruce Lee story. It's a film that pays proper homage, I think, to the man. Okay, historical inaccuracies aside, it still, I think, is a very great tribute in capturing the essence and understanding what he meant. And as I said, along with the music and the performances, there are very much of heartbeat moments of sadness and pathos, but also lots of triumph and euphoria and positivity as well. And I think that really is the best qualities that we want to associate with such an iconic figure such as Bruce Lee. And I think it's for those reasons that we really should pay respect to Dragon the Bruce Lee story, a film that I think is worth watching and one that I would highly recommend. So if I had to give a score for Dragon the Bruce Lee story, I would give it an 8.6 out of 10. So those are my thoughts and review and reflections on Dragon the Bruce Lee story. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm sure a lot of you watching this may have seen the movie by now, so if you have, let me know what you think about it. What were the best elements for you? Was it the fight sequences? Indeed, what was the best fight sequence overall that is a favourite of yours throughout the movie? Do you think there was too much fighting and maybe not enough adhering to the more true life events of Bruce's story and what happened with him? Certainly within his latter stages as well, were you really bothered by the historical inaccuracies or the liberties that they took with the truth? Do you think that somehow tainted the memory of Bruce, or were you more than happy with the approach that they took upon here as well? What do you think of other biopics that have been done about similar iconic figures, and how do you compare them to Bruce Lee, the Dragon story as well? Let me know in the comments, and please also hit those like and subscribe buttons and notifications so I can provide more notifications for you. I will continue to do more reviews such as this when I concentrate on my most favourite movies ever. Plus I will continue the ever-going unrated and underappreciated series where I focus on movies that I believe are really great and didn't get the deserved praise and recognition that they should have got upon release as well. But if you have any other movies that you would like to see me review, and if I've seen them, and you can drop in a request, and I will also provide reviews as well for those movies on this channel. So please hit and like those subscribe buttons. But that's it for now really on, I think, a truly entertaining and very euphoric and very heartfelt movie in Dragon the Bruce Lee story. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.